Hello? Imagine the horror of the past. October 17th, 1938. Moscow is freezing cold, the wind piercing to the bone. You're standing in a dimly lit alley behind a dilapidated house, the smell of coal and rotten cabbage hanging in the air. A boy, no older than 16, stands trembling, his thin coat barely protecting him from the wind. His name is Yuri Volkov, and his eyes, wide with terror, are fixed on the sound of boots crunching on the gravel. You can feel the fear gripping his chest, the certainty that something unspeakable is about to happen. What would you do if you knew your life was no longer your own? Yuri was born in a small village in the Ural Mountains, where the winters were as harsh as the people who lived there. His father, a blacksmith, died in an accident at the factory when Yuri was 9, leaving his mother Anna alone to raise him and his two sisters on scraps of bread and hope. By 1937, the Great Purge had swept through their village like a plague, and whispers about neighbors disappearing in the night became as common as the howling wind. Yuri, with his sharp cheekbones and thin features, caught the attention of an NKVD officer passing by during a routine check. The officer, named Viktor Kuznetsov, was known for collecting gifts for the elite, human sacrifices to satisfy the appetites of those in power. On that autumn evening in Moscow, Yuri was not waiting for a lover or a friend. He was waiting for a car, a black ZS-101, its polished surface glistening in the streetlight like the eyes of a predator. The car belonged to Lavrenti Beria, Stalin's most feared enforcer, whose desires were as boundless as his cruelty. Yuri had been chosen, and that word meant a death sentence. At 16, he was torn from his family, and his mother's cries echoed in the night as he was dragged away. Can you imagine the betrayal of trust, the destruction of a boy's entire world in an instant? How can a soul survive when it is stripped of everything human? The car door opened, and Yuri was pushed inside, the leather seats cold against his skin. The driver, a silent man with a scar on his cheek, did not look at him. The road led them to a dacha on the outskirts of Moscow, hidden among pine trees that stood like silent guards. The house was luxurious, the walls decorated with portraits of Lenin and Stalin, but the air was thick with the smell of cigar smoke and something darker, fear, perhaps, or despair. Yuri was led into a room with a single bed, the sheets clean but stained with the ghosts of those who had been there before him. Beria entered without knocking, and his presence filled the room like a storm cloud. His cold, predatory eyes appraised Yuri like a piece of livestock. "You will do," he said, in a low, hoarse voice. Yuri's heart pounded, his hands trembled, and he grabbed the edge of the bed. He didn't know what was expected of him, but the weight of the pressure was crushing his chest, making it hard to breathe. That night, Yuri learned the first lesson of his new life. To survive, you have to give in. If this story caught your attention, subscribe to the channel. It's a huge motivation for us to continue uncovering hidden truths. And leave a comment below so we know where you're reading or listening from. Are you in a quiet room, or maybe somewhere where the wind carries the same chill as it did in Moscow in 1938? Your support helps keep these stories alive. Yuri's days became a vague mixture of fear and alienation. The country house was a prison disguised as luxury, its halls filled with people who whispered and avoided his gaze. He was given new clothes, silk shirts and trousers, tailor-made, which seemed to him a mockery of his former life. The food was sumptuous, the plates piled high with black caviar and roasted game, but it tasted like ashes in his mouth. Every night, Beria or one of his trusted associates would summon him, and Yuri forced his mind to shut down, imagining that he was back in his village, running through the fields with his sisters. But the reality of his body, used and discarded, was inescapable. The system that allowed all this was as vast as it was invisible, Stalin's regime was built on fear, and the NKVD was its enforcer, a machine that devoured lives to feed the egos of those in power. Male concubines, though rarely spoken of, were the secret currency of the elite, their existence erased from official records. Yuri was one of many, each chosen for his youth, beauty, or vulnerability. Secrecy was absolute. To speak of it was to invite death. But rumors continued to circulate, passed on by those who cleaned the dakas or drove the cars, stories of boys who disappeared when they became too old or too broken. By December 1938, Yuri's spirit was at an end. He had learned to anticipate Beria's mood, to read the glint of cruelty in his eyes. But one night, something changed. Beria arrived drunk, reeking of vodka, and his demands became even more brutal. Yuri's cries echoed through the dacha, but no one came. The next morning, he discovered a bruise on his arm in the shape of a handprint, a mark that would fade over time but never disappear completely. Looking in the mirror, he saw the reflection of a stranger, with empty eyes, the ghost of the boy he once was. What happens when the soul reaches its limit? For Yuri, the answer was close at hand. The January frost of 1939 clung to the windows of the country house, turning them into opaque sheets of ice. Yuri, now 17, had learned to move around the house like a shadow, his footsteps silent on the polished floors. The smell of pine and wax mingled with the faint metallic taste of fear that seemed to permeate every room. His life had become a grim routine, days spent in isolation, nights filled with fear. The other inhabitants of this prison, the maids, cooks, and guards, treated him with a mixture of pity and disgust, averting their eyes from him as if he were a stain on their conscience. Yuri's only solace was a small notebook he found stuffed under the floor in his room. The pages were yellowed, the ink smudged, but it was his lifeline. In it, he wrote down fragments of his thoughts, memories, and anger. "Mom, forgive me," he scribbled one night with a trembling hand. "I didn't choose this." The very act of writing was an act of defiance, a way to reclaim a part of himself. But he hid the notebook carefully. Its discovery would mean punishment, and he had seen what happened to those who broke the rules. A boy named Sasha, who had been at the dacha before Yuri, whispered too loudly about escape. One morning he was gone, and the maids were scrubbing blood off the floor. The system Yuri found himself in was a labyrinth of power and complicity. The NKVD, under Beria's command, operated with ruthless efficiency, its influence extending to all strata of Soviet society. The elite, party officials, military personnel, even foreign diplomats, indulged their vices behind closed doors, their appetites satisfied by a constant supply of victims. Yuri learned their names from overheard conversations. Georgy Malenkov, a rising star of the party, Nikolai Yezhov, the former head of the NKVD, whose downfall was rumored, and others, faceless people whose hands left marks on his skin. This golden cage was a microcosm of the machine, its luxury a facade concealing the horrors within. Yuri was not alone. There were others, boys whose names he learned in fleeting moments: Dmitri, Ivan, Alexei. They exchanged furtive glances in the corridors, their eyes speaking of shared suffering. Dmitri, a thin boy with a scar on his lip. Once, when the guards were distracted, slipped Yuri a piece of bread. "Take it," he whispered barely audibly. But a week later, Dmitri disappeared, and Yuri never found out why. With the onset of winter, Beria's visits became more unpredictable. Sometimes he was cheerful, offering Yuri wine and empty promises of freedom. Other days he was a violent storm of rage, his fists leaving bruises that the maids covered with makeup. Yuri learned to read the signs, the clinking of a glass, the way Beria clenched his jaw. Surviving meant anticipating, adapting, becoming what was needed. But every act of submission took away a piece of his humanity, leaving a void that became increasingly difficult to fill. One night, as snow fell outside the window, Beria brought a guest, a man named Mikhail Ivanov, a high-ranking Red Army officer. Ivanov stared intently at Yuri while Beria laughed, his laughter sounding like breaking glass. "He's yours for the night," Beria said, slapping Ivanov on the shoulder. Yuri felt his stomach twist as he was led into another room and the door closed with a finality that echoed in his bones. The next few hours passed in a fog of pain and humiliation, and when it was over, Yuri lay on the floor, staring at the ceiling, his mind gone to a place where he felt nothing. The next morning, Yuri discovered a new mark on his wrist, a small but deliberate burn from Ivanov's cigarette. It was a reminder, a mark of ownership. Sitting in his room, clutching his notebook, he wrote one word. Why? The question haunted him, but there were few answers. The system was designed to suppress questions, silence dissent, and destroy those who dared to resist. But Yuri was becoming more and more rebellious, like a spark in the darkness. He began to notice patterns, the guard's daily routine, the moments when the dacha was quiet. A plan was forming in his head, fragile but real. Could he escape? The thought was as frightening as it was intoxicating. By March 1939, the dacha had become a prison of routine, its walls squeezing Yuri like a vice. The air was heavy, saturated with the smell of damp wood and stale tobacco, a constant reminder of the people who came and went. Yuri's body was covered with traces of his captivity. Faded bruises, a scar on his shoulder from a belt buckle, a cigarette burn on his wrist that still hurt when touched. At 17, he was no longer the boy who had been taken from his village, but he could not be called a man either. He was something else, something broken and remolded in the image of other people's desires. His notebook was his lifeline, its pages covered with uneven handwriting. He wrote about his mother, about the fields where he played, about a life that seemed like a dream to him. But he also wrote about the dacha, about the men whose names he remembered, about the guards who laughed too loudly at their own jokes. He sketched a plan of the house, a long corridor, locked doors, a window in the kitchen that was sometimes left unlocked. Every word was a rebellion, a refusal to allow his soul to be completely erased. The other boys were just fleeting presences, their numbers dwindling as spring approached. Even a quiet boy with haunted eyes was taken away after a night of screams that echoed through the dacha. Yuri overheard the maids whispering about a hospital, but their tone suggested something much worse. Alexei, the youngest, 15 years old, clung to Yuri in his rare moments of freedom, his thin body trembling when he spoke of his family in Leningrad. "They think I'm dead," he said one night, his voice trembling. Yuri couldn't say anything, only put his hand on Alexei's shoulder, but the gesture seemed meaningless in the face of their reality. Beria's cruelty was constant, but it was its unpredictability that wore Yuri down. One evening, he was summoned to the main hall where Beria sat with a group of men whose faces were red from vodka and power. The room smelled of sweat and alcohol, and the chandelier cast uneven shadows on the walls. Beria handed Yuri a glass of wine, his smile like a knife. "Drink," he ordered, and Yuri obeyed, the liquid burning his throat. The men laughed as Yuri's vision blurred, their voices merging into a cacophony of cruelty. When he came to, he was in his room, his clothes torn, his body aching so badly he couldn't describe it. The system that sustained this horror was a web of complicity whose threads stretched far beyond the dacha. The NKVD ensured silence, its agents embedded at all levels of society. The maids who cleaned Yuri's room, the drivers who took him to and from Moscow, the cooks who prepared his meals, they all knew and they all looked away. Yuri wondered if they were as trapped as he was, their lives bound by fear of the same machine that had crushed him. But their silence was a betrayal, a reminder that his suffering was invisible to the world. One afternoon, sitting by the window, Yuri saw a bird, a sparrow, flapping its wings against the glass. It was trapped, just like him, its desperate movements mirroring his own despair. He opened the window, letting the bird out, and for a moment imagined himself flying away, free from the dacha, from Beria, from the weight of his own skin. The thought was dangerous, but it was also a spark. He began to observe the guards more closely, memorizing their shifts and habits. There was one guard named Pavel, younger than the others, who sometimes lingered at Yuri's door, his eyes softer than the others. Could he be an ally? The question was risky, but Yuri was running out of time. As April approached, Yuri's plan took shape. He had to act quickly before his last reserves of strength ran out. The dacha was a fortress, but every fortress has a weak spot. The kitchen window, which was sometimes left ajar, was his best hope. But escape meant leaving Alexei behind, and that choice tore at his heart. That night, as he lay in bed, the sound of footsteps in the hallway made him jump with fear. The door opened, and Beria appeared in the doorway, his silhouette filling the entire doorway. "Tomorrow," he said quietly and decisively, "you're going to Moscow." Yuri's heart stopped. Moscow meant something new, something worse. A spark of hope flickered, but did not go out. Moscow in April 1939 was a city of contrasts. Statues of heroes stood on wide boulevards, while shadows hid the cries of the damned. Yuri arrived in a black car, the same ZIS 101 that had taken him from his village a few months earlier. The driver, a scarred man whose name Yuri never learned, was silent as always, but the noise of the city, horns, shouts, the clatter of trams, seemed like an attack after the silence of the dacha. Yuri's wrists were bound with a thin rope hidden under his coat, a precaution that felt like a noose to him. They drove to a mansion in the city center, its facade gleaming with fresh paint. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of polished wood and expensive perfume, which contrasted sharply with the dampness and decay of the dacha. Yuri was led into a basement room with bare walls, except for a single mirror. The rope was removed, but its weight remained on his skin. He was told to wait, and the waiting itself was torture, each minute stretching into eternity. A stranger was reflected in the mirror, thin, with sunken eyes, his lips cracked from thirst. Yuri barely recognized himself. The mansion belonged to a man named Grigory Volodin, a party official whose name was spoken with respect and fear. Volodin was a collector, but not of art or books, but of people, those who could serve his ambitions or satisfy his desires. Yuri was a gift, a sign of Beria's favor, intended to ensure Volodin's loyalty. This realization struck Yuri like a blow. He was currency, a commodity. The basement room became his new cage, its silence broken only by the occasional drips from a leaky pipe. That evening, Volodin arrived. His presence was less explosive than Beria's, but no less chilling. He was older, with graying hair and a calculating gaze. "You're an excellent specimen," he said, circling Yuri like a predator. His words were dispassionate and detached, but they carried such weight that Yuri felt a chill run down his spine. Unlike Beria, Volodin preferred to talk, asking Yuri about his village and his family as if they were old friends. But the questions were a trap, a way to strip Yuri of his defenses. When Yuri hesitated, Volodin's smile tightened, and the night ended in pain. Days turned into weeks in the mansion. Yuri was kept in the basement, and his only contact with the outside world was the maids who brought him food. thin soup, and stale bread, a far cry from the feasts at the dacha. He heard snippets of conversations through the walls, talk of purges, executions, Stalin's growing paranoia. The mansion was the center of the elite, a place where deals were made and secrets exchanged. Yuri himself was a secret, known only to a select few. But secrets have a way of leaking out, and Yuri began to hear the whispers of others, boys like him, hidden in other houses, whose lives were as useless as his. One night, Volodin brought a guest, a foreign diplomat whose accent Yuri couldn't place. The man's hands were soft, his words polite, but there was hunger in his eyes. Yuri's only refuge was his notebook, which he had brought from the dacha in his shoe. He wrote in the dark, scratching out fragments of defiance with a pencil. "I am Yuri. I am not one of them." But the words sounded empty as the diplomat's laughter filled the room, and that sound haunted Yuri in his nightmares. Escape from the mansion seemed impossible. The doors were locked, the windows barred. But with every scar on his body, with every night of lost dignity, Yuri's determination grew. He began to study the maids, their daily routine, their moments of inattention. One of them, a woman named Maria with gray streaks in her hair, once looked at him with something resembling compassion. Once she left him a plate with extra bread, a small gesture that seemed like a lifeline to him. Yuri began to wonder if he could persuade her, if she could be his salvation. But trust was a luxury he couldn't afford, and the memory of Sasha's blood on the floor of the dacha was a constant warning. As May approached, Volodin announced a party, a gathering of the elite in honor of Stalin's last decree. Yuri was to be introduced, and the word made him shudder. The preparations were meticulous. His hair was cut, his body washed, and clothes tailored to fit him. He was a trophy, living proof of Volodin's power. But as the date approached, Yuri's plan took shape. The party would be chaotic. The mansion would be full of strangers. This was his chance. Perhaps his only chance. A spark of hope, almost extinguished, flared up again. But at what price would freedom come, and who would he have to leave behind? May 12, 1939, was a night of glitz and debauchery. Music played in the mansion's ballroom, glasses clinked, and men drunk with power laughed. The air was thick with the smell of champagne, cigar smoke, and a faint hint of fear that hung around those who served the elite. Yuri stood in the corner, wearing a tailor-made suit that felt like a costume, his hands clenched to hide their trembling. His hair was slicked back, his face powdered to hide the bruises, but nothing could hide the emptiness in his eyes. He was 19, but he felt decades older, his youth stolen by months of torment. The party was spectacular, a parade of the Soviet elite and their foreign allies. Volodin made his way through the crowd, his smile a mask of charm, while Beria, the guest of honor, watched from a velvet armchair, staring intently at Yuri with a predatory gleam in his eyes. Yuri's role was clear. He was to be visible, to inspire admiration, to be a silent testament to Volodin's status. But beneath the surface, his thoughts raced at the speed of light. The front door of the mansion was guarded, but the entrance to the kitchen, used by the maids, was less guarded. Maria, the maid who had shown him kindness, was working tonight. Yuri passed her a note with one word written on it: help. As the night progressed, the guests became drunker, their voices louder, their hands bolder. Yuri made his way through the crowd, pouring wine and looking for an opportunity. Maria passed by him, her expression unreadable, but she touched his hand and left a small key in his palm. He was sure it was the key to the kitchen door. His heart was pounding, hope and fear battling in his soul. The plan was simple: wait until the chaos reached its peak, slip into the kitchen, and run. But the risk was enormous. If he was caught, he would not survive the night. At midnight, the music reached its climax, and Volodin proposed a toast. The guests raised their glasses, all eyes on him. Yuri saw his chance. He moved toward the kitchen, his steps cautious but quiet, his breathing shallow. The hallway was dark, the sounds of the party muffled. He reached the kitchen door, his fingers trembling as he inserted the key. The key turned with a soft click, and the door opened, letting in the cool night air. Freedom was so close, but the weight of leaving the others behind, Alexei, the boys whose names he would never know, weighed heavily on him. He stepped outside, the gravel crunching under his feet. The city stretched out before him, a maze of lights and shadows. But before he could run away, someone grabbed his arm. It was Pavel, a young security guard from the dacha, now standing guard at the mansion. Yuri froze, his hope crumbling. But Pavel held him gently, his eyes full of conflict. "Go," he whispered, letting Yuri go. "Don't look back." Yuri did not hesitate. He ran, the cold air burning his lungs, the city engulfing him completely. Yuri's escape was not the end but the beginning. He hid in the doorways of Moscow, moving from alleys to attics, surviving on stolen food and the kindness of strangers who asked no questions. His only companion was a tattered but intact notebook, its pages filled with the names of those who had hurt him, those who had helped him, and those he had lost. He wrote about Maria, about Pavel, about the boys whose fate he would never know. The system that had crushed him still existed, its machinery still working. But Yuri was no longer its fuel. Years later, long after Stalin's death, Yuri told his story to a small group of dissidents in a cramped apartment. His voice, firm but scarred, carried the weight of the truth. The Soviet Union was collapsing, its secrets coming to light. Yuri's story was one of countless others, testimony to the horrors hidden behind the regime's facade. He never saw his mother again, but he kept her memory alive in every word he wrote, in every breath he took. The notebook, now kept in a museum, is a relic of a time when human lives were sacrificed to power, a reminder of the price of silence,